Okay, so there's a number of things that we're going to work on articulating in this lecture. Basically, it revolves around what I've perceived as a misapprehension of what the sensing stage means. We confuse it with a lot of other things, and I'm actually going to go through the 6 things that it can get confused with. I'm going to be proposing a subtler distinction, which is also, I think, what the sensor is doing. They're trying to subtleize people's perception of reality and the divine. So another way of thinking about what we're going to try and work on in this lecture is we can look at it as an anatomy of poetic failure, how poets have failed to bridge people into the divine. But we can also look at it as in a sense, kind of a roadmap to how to be an esoteric poet. Because if we can really apprehend what esoteric poetry isn't, then we are much more equipped to actually do it. And so that leads right into our next slide. So what if I can't directly give you the sense that I'm talking about, perhaps we can stir it, awaken it with some clear distinctions. I have got the image here of a cloud covering the mountains, because that seems to be the most accurate image for what I'm talking about. Majority of people are at the bottom of the mountain, looking up. They can't see beyond the cloud. So the part of the mountain that's as far as they can see is for them the top of the mountain. And what I'd like to do is make that cloud transparent so that we can keep refining our understanding and extend it. Because our understanding of what's possible for human development doesn't go far enough. So, that I'm going to go through the 6 ways that, and I could come up with some better terms for it, but this is just the most straightforward terms I could think of, and I want to keep this grounded for you all. Each of these has a different force, and I'm going to go into the poets that fit into each of these categories, and I'm going to lay out why we confuse that with real divinity in art. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Sentimentalizing the sacred. So this is a lot of New Agers will commit this error, both in their own actual creative work, but also in their in the kinds of art that they like. They will see it as divine if it touches and moves them, which is what popular art does. I've also noted that because it is the force of universality, sentiment is universal. Everyone's pretty much experienced heartbreak, anger, etc. We could go on. Isolation, whatever. And so I've sort of put in here that there is almost a collective regression. It's a regression to the lowest common denominator, which you can see in some trance-like states and things like that. So the New Age community does commit this confusion. quite a lot. If something seems beautiful, sweet, again, all sentimental terms, then we think that, oh, that's what's most divine. We're actually confusing and equivocating there. Okay, so that's the first one, the first error. The second one, iconoclasing. So as we go through this, I think it gets more and more subtle. By the way, so we're starting at the most obvious error or confusion. We're building our way through, because we're getting higher up the mountain each time, which is important. So the next one, obviously, so Lord Byron, Walt Whitman. I could list out a whole number of people at this stage of development, and they have a certain force of personality, a charisma. Now, I believe charisma actually means touched by God, if you go back into the etymology. But it's a very indirect touching by God, which is to say that while there is more of reality coming through them than the sentimental stage, it's still not direct. It's still mediated through their self, their way of life. So it's not yet putting us directly in relation to the thing. It's a prism. It's light refracted through a prism. But we can get a more direct relationship to the light. So that's so when we read Walt Whitman, I think it can be easy to think, oh, this is what's really divine. But then you read someone like Blake, and you realize there is a distinction, and that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to subtleize our distinction so that we can be more discerning, because I think that's important. Okay, now this one is, I like the fact that as we go higher up the mountain, we are going to become increasingly controversial. Because my listeners, little in number though they may be, are likely going to be attached to one of these juncture points. And so to hear me say they're not divine could be disappointing. I wouldn't say that they're not divine. I would just say that they're not as divine as it's possible. And that seems an important distinction to make, because we need to, I think, while we can appreciate every stage of development, we ought to really, I think, lay our eyes on the far horizon for a number of different reasons. I think we need to give ourselves room to grow, because I actually get the sense that the current assumptions around what is divine is pretty cramped, that there is a cloud and there's mountain beyond the cloud. Okay, so fermenting. I'm borrowing this term from the alchemy lecture I did a while ago. So this one is, it basically comes down to, there's a sequence of development across each of the stages. And okay, so apologies for the interruption in terms of skipping ahead to the last slide. I'll come back to what I was going to say there, but I thought I would just clearly try and demonstrate with an image what I think is going on here. So there's basically this is we're far enough up the mountain where you can see that there's two mountains in the image. One smaller and one bigger one, covered by clouds. And there's a gulf between them. That gulf is where the scholars are standing on the edge of, by the cliffs. And they can either look out aspirationally across the gulf, like Keats did, and he was starting to develop a language of essence. But that's it's a romantic notion of, as John Vervaeke calls it, a projecting of one's kind of subjectivity onto the blank canvas of the world. So it hasn't yet become familiar with, perhaps conversant with, the structures of reality. And so I keep, whenever I think about the scholar point, where they're at, I always think of a cliff. And so, yeah, it can be related to aspirationally, or it can be related to in the opposite way, almost with a certain recalcitrance, because technically what's happening is that they aren't yet, because they're at the fermenting stage and the alchemical process. So the stone has been purified, and now it's starting to give off a bit of life. So it has some essence in it, or it's connected to some essence, is a better way of saying it. But that's not because they've actually captured it exactly and precisely. It's because they've just gathered enough material that this larger essence archetype can start to be sensed through it, right? So basically what's happening is, without knowing it, by gathering these materials together, these worlds, which is why I've put Tolkien and Milton next to each other, because they're both actually, I would say, doing a very similar thing. With their gathering worlds, and making worlds basically, that then reflect an essence. So they're backing up onto this cliff without knowing that's what they're doing. That they aren't actually aware that what they're engaging in is something higher. And because that isn't conscious, it's not as developed as it could be. Which is why Milton, it isn't really the field that a Shakespeare or a Blake creates, where it's an abundance of essence. It's more one essence, and the same with Tolkien. So I've also put T.S. Eliot there as well, because he and all of these figures have what I call the force of tradition and a certain kind of authority, and they're all kind of world builders, but that isn't yet what a censor is. So let's move on to the next one. Wait, is there anything else before this slide? I mean, you could add in just simply that the cloud is covering the topmost part of the bigger mountain, which is, I guess, capturing that the people on the smaller mountain look at a Shakespeare or a Blake, someone bigger than them, but because they don't see how far it goes, they kind of assume that it's more or less the same kind of poet, And that's what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to illustrate that there are some significant differences. Okay, so now we're going up a little bit. We're actually not crossing the divide, the gulf, but it's another way that artists, thinkers express, basically fall short of bridging the divide. It is still worthy art. So what we have here is Owen Barfield, Ezra Pound, and Jeffrey Hill. So each of these figures is actually looking at, I've called it form-based divinity, because they're not doing something that the scholar, the classic kind of scholar, is doing, where they're kind of unconsciously backing onto essence. They're trying to excavate, is a good word for it, into form to reveal something deeper. It's the beginning of crossing that divide, right? But it's still way too focused on form. Owen Barfield literally is all about how words are fossils of consciousness. Yes, they are. But if words are your only portal into consciousness, you're limited. And that's what we're trying to basically illustrate. You can actually converse directly with the essences of reality, and that is what the sensor does. And that's what Ezra Pound and Jeffrey Hill are on about as well. They're excavators into what they call a vortex of meaning, of fields of force, etc. This has the force of erudition. The advantage is a lot of people like these thinkers and these poets because they're going a little bit further than the traditional scholars, and so they seem like the highest rung, and that's I think an error. It is higher, but there's still more subtle distinctions to make. Okay, so on to the next one. So I just thought I'd quickly add in here another point about something that I see poets like Ted Hughes or Jungian thinkers doing, which is where they seize upon a kind of archetype, but they relate to it in a relatively static way and isolated way. It's a thing for them, whereas essence proper is more like a living field of intelligibility. It's something quite different, and so I'll just add that in there, that little piece, because you do sometimes get people trying to lift into higher, more psychic spaces, but they do it in a very, I almost want to say piecemeal or kind of frozen fashion. Okay, so being, I put Martin Heidegger and Rainer Maria Rilke here because both of them have this kind of what I've been calling a soft focus approach to reality, to their art, to their thinking, philosophy. It's a the term Wu Wei comes to mind. This notion of going with the flow, this notion of being quiet, embracing solitude, not grasping for answers, etc., and allowing that to, through soft focus, allowing that to almost invite being into a fuller expression. But you'll notice that there's a certain kind of passivity here. And while a lot of people, this is the point of what I'm doing, look at these figures as sages, and I think they do so because, again, each of these rungs on the ladder is rectifying in a way the errors of previous rungs, which is good, right? It's just that we need to keep climbing the ladder. And so these guys, what are they rectifying? Well, the grasping of the isolated, calculating subject that's locked in their own mind, which is good, but it's still not crossing the gulf. It's almost embracing the gulf, as it were, and not needing to fix it. It's the aporia that precedes the realization of the later stages. There's another poet at this stage. I'm trying to think of him. It'll come to me. But essentially, we are trying to. There's more than this, and so now let's try and get into what that is. So, there's just one more thing I wanted to explain as far as this. I guess what would we call it? It's not quite a stage of development. I guess it's a stage. It's an expression, a signature, as it were. Is that the force it has is one of detachment. So a really good example in modern times of this is Guy Sangstock, who created circling. I think he exemplifies the way that it is all about inviting relation. That's literally what circling is about. But it is also passive. It's very feminine. Instead of... So it allows divinity to refract through it, but it doesn't capture it. It's not a more prophetic mode, such as we see in the higher stages. So it's kind of like this is the beginning of the turn, or we could call it the metanoia, where they're standing on the cliff, looking out at the beyond, and they're open to it. They're not preferring it to the world. They're just allowing it to express as it might. So it's openness to it, which is good. We need that. But there is more than that developmentally. Because we also need to be able to actually work with it intelligently, which is what the Zen zone above does. Okay, so then there's one more to go. And this is the spiritualist. So now we're at the top of the this is sort of the highest point before you get to the censor, I think. But it's still an error and it's still a confusion to make, and it's one that Owen Barfield wasn't quite able to recognize in Steiner. So by my reading and sense of it, Steiner started with a sense of things, but basically became silly in a way, as he drew on a lot of things, and he opened things up. He blew apart conventional thinking and all of that, but some of it was his sense of things became too idiosyncratic, and it started to blur into more of his feeling about things. And feeling and sensing are not the same thing. They are actually very distinct. It's important to recognize that, because otherwise we commit the error in our own art of basically thinking whatever we feel is what goes, is what's real, which is where we slip back into that irrational romantic projection on the world, which is exactly what sensing is not about. Sensing is about the transjective currents of being. Now we can get into the sensor. So I think this is what Goethe was trying to illustrate, was the sensing stage. Faust is, for those who don't know, it's about a man who sells his soul to the devil because he's had enough of his scholarly life and the emptiness of it. And through his journey with the devil and experience with the world, essentially realizes the divine. I think in Goethe, I don't know how many years ago, 150 years ago, he wrote that. He was ahead of his time, because he was trying to illustrate what I have been trying to illustrate for some time now, and trying to do in this particular lecture, which is to help people grasp the censor as a new type of man. There's a passage in Faust where Faust actually, in his moment of crisis, just before that, or just after, I think it's just before, he contacts the spirit of earth, and he has a taste of it for a moment before it's lost to him. And I think that's him contacting what I've been referring to as essence, which is what he then ends up, reuniting with at the end, with the divine. And I think Goethe made it a point to have Faust actually cross that gulf in his life from scholar to censor, to show that the scholarly mode is limited existentially. It doesn't meet the need and the thirst for divinity that we all actually have. Although I think the more developed you get, the more acute it becomes, and so the more you seek it out. And I forgot to mention that in the previous one, for being, that's more like what would I call it, the force of something like non-grasping, the force of detachment, serenity as well. But here we actually get the force of something like life or divinity itself. It's a more direct, not a more direct. It is kind of a direct. It is a direct relationship with divinity, and the poet is sort of almost like a shaman, is a mediator for that. He becomes that. She becomes that. And so when people relate to them, they relate to this divinity. A modern example of this is John Vervaeke. who's, as far as I can tell, his whole work is about stitching us back into the world and divinity and reality. And I could go on at length about how I think actually all of his ideas have not only served to reveal this, but they have emerged from it. Like, they've emerged from his sensing of reality, and he's sublimated the scholarly mode. He's used it for what he senses to clarify it and reveal it. And in so doing, he's helping other people. He's basically creating tools to help people sense reality, and in so doing, fall in love with being again. So we've basically gone on a journey in this lecture, half an hour, discussing all the ways, all the forces we confuse with the censor. Censor is a more developed person than each of these previous categories. And we just need to get that discernment right, because I think in so doing, we create a less cramped worldview, and we allow back into the picture the divinity that people need a direct relationship with. But perhaps there'll be more on that to come. For now, that's where we'll leave it. Thanks for listening. Just an additional couple of slides here. The first point is I just wanted to highlight what I think. So it was Goethe's sort of genius, I think, to recognize that the battle between the censor and the scholar, which sometimes takes place within one's own person, as in the case of Faust, is in a way, the central sort of battle of our time, the most causal one, because we need to give room for divinity and growth in our picture of reality. Otherwise, we fall prey to solipsism, nihilism, war, materialism, etc. Or an insufficient kind of religion or spirituality that isn't deep enough or real enough or participatory enough. So, and I've tried to illustrate it here with two different photos, or a painting of Faust juxtaposed with Foucault, a postmodern thinker, who seems to me to typify the scholarly and often postmodern skepticism of anything beyond social construction. The issue, besides the fact that the notion that everything's a social construction is just wrong, the issue with it is, of course, that it's also existentially insufficient, as we are collectively finding out. And so, as I've probably mentioned elsewhere, Jesus uses the analogy of the Father, God being the Father. He uses the metaphor of the Father. Why? Scholars would have interpreted that in theological ways. I think the essence of what he was trying to say is that the Son, children, which we are meant to look up at the Father and relate to the Father. Aspirationally, we want to grow into the Father. What scholars like Foucault have done, however, is get rid of any kind of aspirational models. And replace them with the secular materialist counterpart, which is the modern celebrity, who are devoid often of any depth. And so, yeah, I think this is a very key battle of our times. And I'll leave it there for this slide. Okay, so what I wanted to do is just provide a little bit more, two more examples of what I think the censor looks like. Two very similar people, actually, in a way. We've got Emerson on the left and we've got Nietzsche on the right. So how do I go about this? There's sort of 2 points to illustrate. One is that they both talk about at length in their philosophies how they have to rely on their own sense of things. And by sense, I mean this deep meaning of it. So that's why Emerson says, "Trust thyself, every heart vibrates to that iron string." He also said, "In every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with certain alienated majesty," which is his way of, I guess, provoking us to utilize our own sense of things more. Because if we don't, we end up seeing it in others. And yeah, I mean, I could go into the meaning of that quote more, but the point I'm trying to make is that it is all about our own sense of things, which is why Nietzsche, his favourite writer was Emerson and Goethe, both senses. Nietzsche also has a quote in his long essay, which is a very good one, called Schopenhauer as an Educator. And he talks about how he waited for a long time to find a teacher who would coax him out of his shell, basically, as a thinker. And then none coming, he had to do it himself, which is the sensing move. And so that's sort of the first point. Second point is both of those men, I know people said it about Nietzsche, and I know people said it about Goethe also, and I think they said it about Emerson. I need to find some quotes, but I do recall reading somewhere about people finding them essentially austere, hard to get a handle on, reserved, didn't enter the usual drama of the world, of their lower natures. So quite lofty, serious in a way. But serious not in the way that a scholar is. I mean, that's why Nietzsche called it the gay science, because there's a joy, spiritual joy that comes with it, but it does appear to be quite serious and lofty. They definitely said that about Goethe in Conversations with Eckermann. I believe they were talking about, I think Eckermann was talking to Goethe's contemporaries, and they all found him hard to relate to in a way. And that is, of course, what we also see in Faust. And Goethe illustrates that quite clearly in the opening parts of Faust, because the village is having a party, and Mephistopheles tries to tempt Faust with drink and revelry and all of that, and it doesn't work. It slips right off him, because Faust is about more serious matters. Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, I just wanted to come back to that point about Faust connecting to Gaia, and I believe, it's not just Gaia is this like field or matrix of light, and that is what is the censor works with. And so I think Faust is really illustrating a lot of really quite essential things, and he was doing it through this alchemical language available to him at the time, and Emerson was using religious language, as did Nietzsche, and philosophical language, and I've been lucky enough to have John Vervaeke's language to draw on here as well. But what we're trying to do, I think, is illustrate that it is a type of development and personality. And maybe just while things are floating around, I know this is kind of a bit freeform, but there's an overarching purpose to this. Rilke is someone, so his Duino elegies, I think that's how you say it, came to him, right? That he heard the voice, as did Milton, by the way, at an earlier or another stage. But that is how it would appear if you were at the being stage, if you recall. But the being stage, you're open to everything, but you're not actually able to flow with it. You're just open to it passively, like a flower that's kind of drinking in the sunlight, rather than, I don't know, an eagle or something like that. And I think that when you're on that secondary lower mountain and you haven't crossed the gulf to the sensing stage yet, to actually connect to reality, what happens is creativity. I don't know how to put this. There seems to be something. You don't need poetry to just come to you as though it's not you. That's a very passive way of doing it. Like inspiration is dictation. Because that still implies, weirdly, some kind of subject-object duality and split. Because that's not, when you're at the sensing stage, you blend, it's no longer subject or object. It's sort of just reality realizing itself. You're in the flow of intelligibility. And the flow of intelligibility is in you. So I just wanted to make that point, and I think that's what Blake means by when he says he received his poem by dictation. It's not the same thing as how Rilke received his. That's my impression. Okay, so we've illustrated the sensing category. Now there's just like one more piece to slot in where we're going to try and bring it all together. So in the style of nature, I've tried to come up with some basically taglines a tag for each of these stages, just because I'm trying to be as straightforward as I can. So we've got the different confusions, the different things that get confused for the sensing stage on the left. Now let's go through the tags. So the sentimental stage, I think a good example of this is Mary Oliver, but we get a lot of spiritually sentimental poetry art out there. I would call them generous, the generous ones, because when we read them, we feel touched and moved by their calm, wise, compassionate energy, and we find it beautiful. Then we get to the iconoclast, so Byron, Whitman. I like the charismatic one because, as I said, I think charisma means touched by God, so we feel like there's something special there. The scholar, we get the deep and serious thinkers, right? When we and there's something Milton, even in his sonnet to Shakespeare, he talks about how his numbers compared to Shakespeare's are slow and I think I'm paraphrasing, clumsy, awkward. And there's that slow, turgid, almost aspect to the deep and serious thinker, but I'm trying to use tags that capture why we look up to them. Because we do look up to these thinkers, because they are deep and they are serious. Nietzsche, as the censor, did criticize the scholar with I think quite an apt quote, where he said, "Scholars are like snakes that have eaten and failed to digest an elephant, because they're all knowledge, rather than digest its wisdom." To digest knowledge is to get a sense of things, which is wisdom. Okay, so, but then we get the erudites. So these are the wise and open thinkers. So when we look at Geoffrey Hill, Ezra Pound, Owen Barfield, we actually look at them as really wise and open, because we're comparing them to the deep and serious thinkers. And yes, it's somewhat of a blurry line between the two, right? But with the wise and open thinkers, there tends to be more of an emphasis on, as I've called it, a bit more of a conscious attempt to realize divinity, but it's still just through a form focus. Divinity as a more immanent presence. Because in Eliot, it's far off. In Tolkien, it's sort of the atmosphere of the world he's created. In Milton, it's also, curiously enough, far off. So yeah. Whereas the others, the wise and open ones, are trying to bring it here, but they're doing so, I think, quite cumbersomely, because it's too limited, static, isolated, focused on form. Okay, so that's that one. And then finally we have the mystics. So I've used that word in the sense that Blake uses it, which is it's a genuine mysticism, for sure, but also it is connected to the word mystify, because as Viveki criticized Heidegger in one of his talks, mentioning that he fell prey to Nazism because he mystified himself and inflated himself too much. Because the being does kind of view itself as, all of these actually stages think they're at the top of the hierarchy in a weird way, maybe with the exception of the sentimental, the generous ones. Because again, as with, so Heidegger he asks the question of being, right? So he's open to it, but he doesn't answer it. And he even acknowledges that his being in time fails to put forward any kind of answer, which is, at worst, obscurantism. There isn't any kind of, nothing's put forward. So it's all, which is if you go fully masculine, you're always calculating, but you're separated from what you're talking about, so you can never really capture it. If you go full feminine, then you, symbolically, you never put anything forward. You can't, because you're always in an open relation. And it's a way of hiding behind mystery, which is something that Blake did not like, because he saw that that's what priests did a lot of the time, and it was their way of never having to take responsibility and never having to not just sense things and put things forward that would help people, but yet to help people do that for themselves. Mystery is a tool of oppressors, in a way. Okay, and then finally we've got the free thinkers, Steiner being the example here, because Owen Barfield loved Steiner because he saw that he was so free, and that was what drew him to him. Okay. Now, yep, there is one more point about Nietzsche. He had a very discerning intellect. So I think he had the sense he was just... And I think he was working towards being able to put forward a kind of positive vision, as Emerson did. So here's another table, trying to make it even clearer what I think divinity gets confused with in each stage. So first we get confusing it with pleasant feeling, beautiful, compassionate, loving feeling, which it isn't. It's more than that. It can express through feeling, just like light can move through water. But it's not the water, it's the light, right? It's also not the personality. It's not something innately special. It's hard to really pin down this one. It's not within the self, is another way of putting it, because that's just one pole. Okay, it's also not, and so as we've gone through this, we've actually some quite satisfying parallels. So, because feeling is a kind of more passing thing. And personality is a little bit more lasting, but both of them are sort of mediums. Then we get the scholars, the traditional thinkers, who tend to relegate it to the transcendent it's in a realm that can't be touched, which is an interesting move to do because it kind of freezes and reifies it and puts it out of touch. Then you get the erudite, who are doing a good move because they're breaking out of that frame and they're trying to show that it is immanent. So, as Owen Barfield does, consciousness is within the form of words and in meaning. So it's all immanent. But in so doing, they also freeze and reduce the free-flowing dynamic scope of what the light actually is. Okay, so it's not transcendent, it's not immanent. Two classic errors. And then you get the mystics who think that it is in receptivity itself, the state of this. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The state of not grasping. But it's not that either. Sure, it can express itself probably or come into expression a little bit more than it can with the previous stages. But that's just because there isn't a frame being put on things. But you can still flow with it more intelligently. But it's also not just pure activity or projection either. So it's none of these things. As I explained in the big essay on poetic consciousness, the subject, it's more like and I've already mentioned it in this lecture, reality is realizing itself. So subject, object, we contact something purer than feeling or personality that is both transcendent and immanent, and we are both receptive to it and we are participating in it. So it's not any one of these things, and to make it one of these things is to reduce it, confuse it, and misapprehend it, and therefore to be less effective in our not just in our own art, but in reading and engaging with other people's art at this level. I think that's the clearest way to put it. So just a few more slides to further clarify the sensing stage. So this was a quote of Jung's in his book Ion, where he talks about what the post-Christian spirit looks like. And he says, arrogant, hysterical, woolly-minded, criminally amoral, fanatical, a purveyor of shoddy spiritual goods, spurious art, philosophical stutterings, and utopian humbug, fit only to be fed wholesale to the mass man of today. So that's right. All of these, I'm not saying that all of these stages are charlatans, far from it. They're all valid, but if we terminate our conception of development at any one point along this sequence, I think we do something really detrimental to our culture. And I think this is kind of what Nietzsche's Übermensch was about. Now, he was close to getting this, I think, the censor, basically. But the Übermensch projects his values, creates values, which isn't what the censor does. The censor creates some imparticipation with reality. So Nietzsche did the best he could. But that I'll come back to that point. To the mass man, any one of these stages is good. It's giving him contact with something more real. But we need to keep climbing the mountain, Mount Parnassus, Parnassus, which is the Mount of Inspiration in Greek mythology. And we need to be able to recognize and discern because ultimately what we're doing here, what John Vervaeke is trying to do, is again stitch man back to the reality. And if we don't go far enough up the mountain, we end up with a worldview that's inherently separative, isolated, cut off. And that is, I think, pretty disastrous, to be honest. And there's a kind of meaninglessness there too, and people are suffering because of that. So it behooves artists and thinkers, any creative kind of spirit, to do what they can to mend and connect us back to that. I mean, that is, of course, the meaning of religion, is religio, religare, from ligament, to bind back. Okay, so the next slide is, I just wanted to further clarify some good quotes from Jung that help to illustrate, I think, what the sensing person, individual, experiences. So this is him on Nietzsche. He writes, this is, I think, in a letter or a seminar on Nietzsche, and he says, "That was the reason for the bombastic language, the piling up of metaphors, the hymn-like raptures, all the vain attempt to catch the ear of a world which had sold its soul for a mass of disconnected facts." In other words, for the kinds of things that scholars were providing to the masses. And he goes on to say in a letter that, you know, it stems in a big way from Nietzsche's lack of connection, because the censor does, I think, experience a lack of connection. And I'm going to get to that in the next slide. But it's basically because his being is in the blind spot of culture. So how to put this? His being is that which culture hasn't yet thought possible. So it's not only, he's not even a hypothesis to culture. So his whole being is, and his whole sensitive array is in the blind spot, unacknowledged. And that's also why he is as austere as he is, or she is, because for them, I think connection on that which most matters, what they sense, is quite the main thing. It's not going to be connecting to talk superficially about things, because he isn't, or she isn't, superficial. And this goes to the next quote, which is Jung's famous one. Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. Because the censor is in the position basically recognizing that people are suffering from a cause that they do not know, but he, the censor, knows, which is that they are disconnected from reality, and can be connected to it. And so that brings us to the final slide. So yeah, I just wanted to say there was a quote of, I think again, Eckermann's conversation with Goethe, where he says something along the lines of Goethe didn't understand philosophy enough to know where he was, like what his position was in relation to others, and that was why he liked talking to Hegel and other philosophers. He didn't quite get, I think, how radical his notions around, for instance, delicate empiricism were, which is all about contacting the essence of archetypal essence of a plant. And that's true, because that was just Goethe's way of being. That was his being. And he didn't realize that what he was innately radical relative to the philosophy and culture of the time, which is still the case for censors today. Their being starts beyond where others reach, even in their highest moments, if that makes sense. That the lowest moments of the censor is going to be higher than the highest moment of someone in the being stage, for instance, because their sensitivity, in a sense, is their being. Their being is the instrument that the breeze of the spirit of divinity plays. So I think that's a good and sufficiently poetic note to leave it on. So thank you for listening, and we'll see where this goes next.